To mark the 10th anniversary of Campaign Against Antisemitism and the 100th episode of this podcast, my guest today is Gideon Falter, the Chief Executive of Campaign Against Antisemitism, a charity dedicated to countering antisemitism through education and zero-tolerance law enforcement. Gideon was elected to lead CAA in the autumn of 2014, soon after its establishment, building it into the UK's foremost campaigning organisation against antisemitism. His work for CAA has been publicly praised by the British government. The Allgemeine has awarded Gideon as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center has hailed him as a Jewish hero who proves that there are still powerful ways to leverage democratic rules to serve justice and protect Jewish community. Gideon, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you for having me on our podcast.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
You kept me off the airways for a long time.
We saved the best till the last. This is not the last episode, so look, let's start.
It's also not the best episode.
The listeners will be the judge of that.
Okay.
Why and how was CA created?
It was a while ago, it's a decade ago, 2014. There was a Gaza war then that lasted about 6 weeks, and there was just this absolute outpouring of anti-Semitism in a way that I hadn't seen before. I'm sure other people had seen it, but I was just completely shocked. And to give you some idea, there was the UK Jewish Film Festival, which had been using this venue, which was then called the Tricycle, for 13 years. And the Tricycle come to them and they're just like, look, bit awkward, but can you just renounce any funding from the Israeli embassy, and then you can go ahead and have your film festival. And the UK Jewish Film Festival basically said, well, we're a Jewish film festival, not a Zionist film festival, not an Israeli film festival, just Jewish film festival. You've also got film festivals which are linked to a country, like I think they had the Chinese Film Festival or the Afghan Film Festival or something like that back then. And you don't put conditions on them, so why us? And at the same time, we also had sort of much more in-your-face stuff. So people were going into supermarkets and just clearing all of the kosher food onto the floor. We had people spray painting synagogues. There was one picture that really stuck in my mind of a man walking down the street with a big sign he'd made saying, "Save Gaza, Hitler, you were right." And then in the corners, he'd written other little slogans like, "Jews are the real terrorists." And all of this is going on. I studied law originally, and I was just looking at it thinking, this stuff's all illegal. Almost all of it is illegal, and the police don't seem to be doing very much about it. People aren't getting arrested. Where are the consequences? And back then, Facebook, I don't know if you've heard of it, it was this app that there used to exist. Facebook was still a thing, and I came across a few other people who were writing comments on each other's posts about what was going on. This was kind of back when also Facebook was an actual community, with people you actually knew rather than just reels of people dropping yogurt and things like that. We kind of found each other, organised a demonstration outside the Tricycle actually, and the Tricycle demonstration was the first one I turned up to. And the Tricycle U-turned and caved in and said, "We're sorry, we should never have told you to, we should never have put conditions on the UK Jewish Film Festival." By the way, the film festival correctly said, too late, we're gone, which was the right principle move, I think. But what I then suggested was, look, why don't we hold a big demonstration calling for what we really want here, which is zero tolerance enforcement of the law when it comes to anti-Semitism. And we put ads out in the Jewish newspapers. We had no money, so this was all sort of from a few £100s from each other and from family and friends. We put ads in the Jewish newspapers, we called a demonstration, and all of a sudden we were outside the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand. Thousands of people turned up, the chief rabbi comes to speak, and I just realised that not only did we have backing within the Jewish community, but also there were a lot of non-Jews who were outraged at what they were seeing, who were sort of willing us to succeed. And also we kind of placed upon ourselves a responsibility to do this work. If you say you're going to do something, you've then got to go and do it. And we kind of took Campaign Against Antisemitism forward and started bringing in volunteers, and the story goes on from there, I guess.
So that was 2014. It's now 10 years later, 2024, and I want to get your take on what's happening right now, because the world is a very different place. At the time of this recording, we've just passed the 1-year anniversary of Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. To what extent do you think those attacks changed the nature of anti-Semitism, not just in the UK, but worldwide?
The attacks themselves, I don't think created new anti-Semites or anything like that. It's not like people sort of saw Hamas brutally murdering, raping, burning people alive, taking hostages, and thought, yeah, more of that, please. I now hate the Jews because I'm now convinced. I think it was more the case that a lot of people have for a long time sort of been drinking in conspiracy theories. I think actually the period during COVID where people just spent a hell of a lot of time at home online changed a lot of things as well. But they've just spent a lot of time on social media drinking in conspiracy theories, drinking in really extreme ideologies. And then comes this moment, this kind of this floodgates moment where people feel that they can come out and express this kind of hatred. And at first you see little expressions of it. So October 7th happens and you see people posting pictures, for example, of scenes from October 7th, and the captions are things like heroes or victory to the Intifada, that kind of a thing. And it goes from then, literally we're talking sort of in days, to within 24 hours there's a big demonstration outside Israeli embassies around the world. Here in Britain, here in London, we get people out on the streets clapping, dancing. We then have a big demonstration outside the Israeli embassy. There was no Israeli response at this moment. And we go from there, from this sort of these sort of initial steps of expressing anti-Semitism in a much more open, much more visceral way, to the weekly marches, and then seeing those grow and grow and grow. And I think October 7th has turbocharged anti-Semitism across the world. I think that it has made anti-Semites feel that they are part of something where they're on the right side of history, where they have popular support, where there are a lot of people sort of backing them and egging them on. And I think that it has created a completely new reality for Jews in the diaspora, not just here in Britain, but all across the West.
So in this new reality, how has CAA changed following the 7th of October? What has CAA been doing in the wake of this new reality that Jews face?
We've had, if you look at the past year, because obviously it's now been a whole year, at the beginning were just finishing work on a project which was our Roger Waters documentary. So we'd put out our documentary about Roger Waters. We had revealed, for example, the dirty kike email, bandmates talking about the things that he used to get up to, telling their stories, reporting their recollections. And on October 6th, I kind of sat the team down and said, look guys, everyone's worked fantastically hard on this. Take the weekend for a bit of a break. Our last thing that we're doing on this particular project is on October 9th, on Monday. We'll do that and then on to the next thing. And instead, on October 7th, the world completely distorts, not just for Jewish people, but particularly for anybody involved in fighting anti-Semitism. The world's a whole new everything has changed, everything has shifted. So in the immediate aftermath, we sort of sprang into action. We started running sort of mass mobilization events for volunteers. Obviously, we've always been volunteer-led, so bringing in new volunteers was essential to be able to scale up what we're doing. We start completely changing the way that we do case management, because we go from like a garden hose of anti-Semitism to a fire hose of anti-Semitism to a tsunami of anti-Semitism, and we very quickly have to change the way we deal with cases coming in, how fast we respond to them, how fast we get lawyers on them. We started hiring people. We just felt, look, this is an emergency. We have to do whatever it takes. we started sending people out into the demonstrations that were happening, the protests, and that yielded a hell of a lot of information, part of which we passed to the police and the authorities, part of which we expose online so that people understand exactly what's going on at these demonstrations. And as we did that, we started to see more and more overt displays of anti-Semitism, people literally dressed as Hamas terrorists, even people dressing their kids as Hamas terrorists, and police posing alongside them or not doing anything about it. Obviously, there have been these sort of notorious scenes of police officers saying things like swastikas on placards. You have to understand them in their proper context. So we rapidly realized that policing was a major problem. The police weren't doing their job. So within weeks of October 7th, we're demonstrating outside Scotland Yard. We had billboards that we put up across London and across the UK showing the faces of child hostages. And one of the most memorable moments for me of that early sort of aftermath of October 7th, we had billboard trucks that were driving around London showing the faces of these children, the children kidnapped by Hamas, not even the adults, the children. And one night, volunteers call up and they're in tears saying, that the vans have been stopped. And, we just said, okay, slow down, take your time, what's happened? And of course, what we then found out was that the police had basically told our billboard vans to shut down and get out of London, and I didn't believe it. So I didn't fully believe that this is what happened. I thought maybe something had been misunderstood. So I actually went myself with the billboard trucks and saw it for myself. They stopped us, they pulled me out to the pavement, they held me at the pavement, they told the truck drivers to shut off the billboards and get out of London. So we were sort of rapidly realizing not just that the police were taking no action against the protests, or very little action, but that when people stood up to the protests and stood up against Hamas and voiced what was basically the law, for example, even saying that Hamas are terrorists, they were getting arrested, that our billboard trucks were getting shut down and told to leave London. And that kind of ended up with us doing a lot of work with the then government. There's obviously a new government, which we're also talking to about this stuff, basically saying, look, the police aren't doing their jobs. They are not using existing criminal offences. They're not using existing legislation to the effect that it should be used for. We need you to tighten up the law. We need you to take action. So there's been a hell of a lot of government engagement. We've done things that we would never have imagined doing. So, for example, the March Against Antisemitism, where we have 105,000 people marching through London. If you consider the UK's Jewish population is about 250,000 people, and over 100,000 people turn up on a demonstration, the odds are that a lot of the people on that demonstration weren't Jewish. So a lot of our work has also been in saying to people, look, what's happening with anti-Semitism isn't just about the Jews, it's about much more than Jews. And we need your solidarity, we need you to stand with us. So that's kind of a snapshot of it. We've also done a huge amount of work on campuses, and I can't express strongly enough how bad the radicalization of our young people is. 9%, nearly 1 in 10 of our young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, according to our polling, 1 in 10 of them nearly favor Hamas. They have a favorable view of Hamas. We've got these huge percentages who say that the Israelis are behaving like the Nazis. I think that's something like 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds. I think 41%, or was it 43%, said that they felt uncomfortable spending time in the company of someone who supports Israel. And if you consider that's the majority of Jews, you start to see what kind of situation Jews on campus are facing. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we've been doing.
In addition to our education work, we can't really talk about campaigning against anti-Semitism without touching on our litigation. I think a lot of people know us best for this work. We've had a lot of legal victories against anti-Semites, sometimes not only without the assistance of the criminal justice system, but actually in the faces of its opposition. Is there a case that you think was particularly meaningful to you or significant to our cause? And what message do you think these convictions send, not just to anti-Semites, but to Jewish people as well?
It's really hard to choose just one, so I'll give a couple of examples if I can. So one was a very early case that we did where the Crown Prosecution Service was refusing to prosecute someone. This was a neo-Nazi leader. He had, there'd been a sort of march against the Jewification of Golders Green, which for those who are listening who've been to Golders Green will know that it's a little bit late. But they wanted to do a march against the whatever Jewification is. They wanted to march against Jewification, and we said we're going to counter protest. We ended up in a sort of negotiation with police. The police agreed to move the neo-Nazi group out of Golders Green and put them in a sort of kettling pen off Whitehall instead. And when they do this, one of these guys, one of their leaders, stands up and makes a speech which literally ticks off pretty much every anti-Semitic trope from medieval blood libel through to modern libels about Jews controlling media and politics today. And this was all caught on video. It's an obvious sort of slam dunk, as it were, of a prosecution. We go to police, they do a stand-up investigation, they pass it to the Crown Prosecution Service, and the CPS says, no, we're not prosecuting this guy. And this was, bear in mind, one of our first sort of interactions with the criminal justice system. And we said, okay, we think your decision's wrong, we disagree with it, we'd like victims' right of review. And they essentially said to us something along the lines of, victims' right of review is for victims of crimes. This guy's speech was against all Jews. You're not all Jews. You can't, there was like crazy arguments going on. And so we said to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, okay, we're going to take you to judicial review. And I think there was just this disbelief in the Crown that the Jewish community, this meek Jewish community that's, sort of like their maximum level of response is like really angry letter. They're going to actually sue us and take us to judicial review. And they didn't take it seriously for a long time until basically the day before. We'd won the sort of first round of the judicial review where you get permission to actually go ahead. And then it was the second round where a judge was going to decide whether or not their decision to not prosecute this man should be reversed. And they kind of called up and they started saying, well, maybe we can offer you some costs and things like that. And I said, look, the one thing we're interested in is you prosecuting this man. They took it away, they came back and they prosecuted him. He was unanimously found guilty by a jury. He was immediately sent down to prison for a year despite having no prior convictions. That for me was a really important case because there are lots of cases where we've gone against anti-Semites, but I feel that every time we in the Jewish community enforce the law against anti-Semites, it's actually a failure. Even when we win, it's a failure because that's the job of the authorities. That's what they're supposed to do. They do it for every other minority. If they're not doing it for us, it's a failure. So that was, I think, sort of a really meaningful case. There have been plenty of others. The Equality and Human Rights Commission investigation into the Labour Party, that was an enormous sort of vindication at a time where everyone was just saying, there is no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, you're making it up. That was a massive vindication when the Equality and Human Rights Commission said, no, there has been unlawful harassment, discrimination against Jews going on within the Labour Party. There was another great case where we managed to use a sort of like 1970s era type of court order to unmask an anti-Semitic troll. This was a case where basically it established in the 1970s that you can sue someone who knows who the guilty party is and force them to reveal who that guilty party is, even though they haven't done anything wrong themselves. So we sued Virgin Media and forced them to reveal the identity of this horrendous internet troll, who ended up going to prison. It was another case where it was complicated because at the beginning, the judge didn't give him a custodial sentence. We had to go to the Attorney General, get the sentence overturned, and get him sent off to prison. But there have been many cases. Some of them have also been personally very difficult for me. There was a case, for example, with a disgraced aristocrat who'd actually come up to me in a courtroom after I'd finished testifying and started shouting all sorts of things at me, calling me effing Jewish scum and the like. And that prosecution, the police lost the interview tape. The Crown Prosecution Service, there were I think 5, me plus 4 other witnesses. The CPS told 2 of them not to bother coming. And so the prosecutor who was prosecuting it didn't really seem to know that until the case started. And so we end up where the prosecutor's standing there in court, kind of his arm tied behind his back, with 3 people to testify. There's me, there's another member of CAA staff who was with me when this incident happened, and there was a young man who was doing work experience for a lawyer, and the police hadn't interviewed him until a year after the incident. So it was kind of like my word and this other colleague's word against this individual. Situations like that, they're really trying, because it comes down to it comes down to a matter of faith in the criminal justice system, and thankfully there was CCTV and various other things. But when you're in the hands of a jury and you wonder who are these 12 members of the public and what do they think, it's daunting, really daunting.
It's interesting because you run a charity where one of the main things that we do is help victims of anti-Semitism. And in that moment, you yourself, Gideon Falter, was the victim of an anti-Semitic incident. What was that like to sort of be on the other end, not the end where you're sort of helping a victim, but sort of being the one who experienced it? And what did that experience teach you going forward about how we work with other victims?
I think, look, in my life, up until we started an anti-Semitism charity, in my life I'd been pretty lucky in that I hadn't really experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. Like at school, someone called me a Jew boy, and I just thought it was a descriptive term. I was like, yeah, I am a Jewish boy, that kind of thing hadn't really happened a lot to me. There'd been incidents, there'd in fact been something where I'd been the victim of an anti-Semitic incident, had to testify in court as well, but it's not something that happens a lot. And I guess what it reminded me is that each of the people that we help to deal with anti-Semitism, they deserve more credit than they get, because they're not just getting justice for themselves. They're standing up, often in quite uncomfortable circumstances, and getting justice for not just the Jewish community, but also for the public at large, for other people. These people rarely just hate Jews, right? And it's really daunting, because even though, I've studied law, I've been in the court cases that we run many times, I know what the process is like, I know everything that happens, but when you are a witness, taking the witness stand, you're on your own. You are being examined by the prosecutor, who sort of takes you through your statement, and then you're cross-examined by potentially a very cunning, clever defense barrister whose entire job is to try to make it look like you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't remember properly, or maybe even making it up, or whatever it is. And in that moment, you really feel a reminder, for me anyway, of the bravery of a lot of the people who come forward. So I guess it kind of reminded me of that. I think that the process is actually less daunting when you know how it works, and that's why we try to prepare people, understanding the process when they come to us. But it is, it's sticking your neck out a bit, and it's uncomfortable, and I think people deserve more credit than they get.
So after everything that CAA has done, after all the trials that CAA has undertaken, do you have faith in the justice system?
I have much less faith than I had. Particularly when you're studying law, you look at the British justice system, and particularly my degree looked at French law and EU law as well. And so you look at other justice systems around the world and you think, wow, we've got something really fantastic. British justice is, pretty good. Any human system of justice is going to be fallible, but this is pretty great. And you then start to see the cracks that emerge in it. And one of the cracks, recently, for example, there was that case where there were the women who were walking with pictures of paragliders taped to their back. And the judge basically says, yeah, you're guilty of a terrorism offence here. You're guilty of support for Hamas, but I'm not going to punish you. I'm going to let you go. That kind of thing really dents people's faith in the justice system. And I think what's hard is that every year we do polling of the Jewish community, and we see every year people's faith in the criminal justice system tanking. And I think the reasons for that, partly the courts with very lenient sentences. I think partly it's that the Crown Prosecution Service seem to have developed a specialty almost in coming up with reasons why anti-Semites can't be prosecuted. They prosecute something like 15,000 hate crimes a year, of which it's usually a couple of dozen that are in relation to anti-Semitism, even though we're at record levels. And then the police, where you see police officers saying things like, oh yeah, you can beam from the river to the sea on Big Ben, and you can shout anti-Semitic abuse at people. You can even hold a vigil for the leader of Hezbollah being taken off the face of the earth, and we're not really going to do anything. Swastika placards depends on the context. So my faith in the British justice system is very dented, but it's what we've got.
A few moments ago, you touched on Labour and the EHRC, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, where do you think Labour is now on anti-Semitism compared to where it was? And what do you think the future of anti-Semitism is in British politics?
So Labour obviously went on this crazy journey. Back in 2015, I was approached by the volunteer who runs our political and government investigations unit. And he said to me, we need to talk about someone called Jeremy Corbyn. Looks like he's standing to be leader of the Labour Party. And I was like, who's Jeremy Corbyn? And we started looking at his file and things like calling Hamas and Hezbollah friends. I think something that now in 2024 people instinctively understand to be disgusting. But back then people were like, yeah, no, people, some politicians might say that, you've got to talk to all sides, that sort of thing. And you start looking at some of the things he'd done, like defending Reverend Stephen Sizer, who had said that Mossad was behind 9/11, or inviting a cleric, Raed Salah, to Parliament as a quote-unquote very honoured citizen. This is a blood libeller who was banned from the UK. And you realise you've got a big problem, and the Labour Party obviously goes on this journey. I think since the end of the Corbyn era in Labour, I think Keir Starmer had a lot of sceptics to win over, and I've got to confess, me included. I looked at him and I just thought, here is a guy who sat on the front benches under Corbyn for years and didn't utter a peep really about anti-Semitism. We just didn't hear anything. Lots of brave people in Labour stood up against anti-Semitism, but not Starmer. And he takes over the party, and to be fair to him, he's done a pretty good job. And I think he's won over a lot of skeptics who thought he's not going to do anything. He's done a pretty good job. There have been wobbles, like Rochdale, particularly memorably. But I think they've been on a journey. Where we are now, though, is not a very happy place, because Labour promised things during the election which don't seem to have happened. So, for example, they've said that they were going to proscribe Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. No sign of that happening so far. And yet, they have been making fairly strident moves. So, like, on the day that Israel buried 6 hostages who had been executed in cold blood by Hamas after nearly a year of captivity, on that day, Britain slaps an arms embargo on Israel on the basis of legal advice. However, at the same time, Britain is somehow able to decide that far from an embargo on UNRWA, the UN Refugee and Works Agency, which looks after specifically the Palestinians, and where employees of UNRWA had been proven to be involved in October 7th attacks, Britain decides to reinstate funding to UNRWA. So you sort of look at things like that and you think, what kind of government makes a decision to slap an arms embargo on a country that is defending itself against a genocidal anti-Semitic terrorist group that just committed the worst anti-Semitic atrocity, worst single anti-Semitic atrocity since the Holocaust, and yet decides to give money to an organisation like UNRWA, which is riddled with flaws in this regard.
I think something else that CA is really known for is our innovation and how we think outside of the box. I'm particularly referring now to our comms work. We've done a lot of very interesting things to get our message across. We've used a projector to project anti-Semitic tweets onto Twitter's London headquarters, highlighting their failure to act on online anti-Semitism. We've staged targeted protests outside the BBC. We have launched unprecedented national billboard campaigns, which has featured Holocaust survivors and a Haredim. We have hired the digivans, which you alluded to earlier, to display the images of hostages when billboard companies took our images down, and when digivans actually started to refuse to display our messaging after the police incident that you mentioned earlier, we bought our own. We said, okay, we'll do it ourselves. We have, as you said, we've gone into the hostile demonstrations to expose these people. A lot of these things, some people may look at and they may be like, that's a bit much. Why does CA look at this idea and go, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
We are, look, like everybody, we look at the risks. Everything we do, we think about it, we think, what are the pros, what are the cons? Is this something that's actually going to advance the cause? But if the answer is yes, it's going to advance the cause, then we go for it. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I think for a lot of organisations, particularly charities actually, the sector is very regulated, you can get into trouble if you do the wrong thing. There is a real tendency, I think, to sort of play it safe all of the time. And unfortunately, we live in a time where we cannot afford to play it safe. We've got to obviously take everything into account, we've got to mitigate risk and all the rest of it, but we live in a time where anti-Semitism is surging like never before. Certainly not in my lifetime. And we have to do whatever it takes. We've got a Jewish community and a country which is relying on us to do whatever it takes to defend British Jews, to fight back against the ideologies that are promoting anti-Semitism, the far left, the far right, Islamist extremists. And so if there's something risky or unusual that needs doing in order to further our cause, yeah, we'll give it a go, and it might be that others wouldn't, but that's our job, that's our role. We're a campaigning organisation.
Let's talk about our policy work. We produce some pretty indispensable work in that area. Few things. We submit reports to Parliament. We conduct essential polling. We meet with ministers and civil servants. We appear before committees and much more. Why do you think these appearances are important in general?
Ultimately, the thing that is going to change the game is if the state acts against anti-Semitism. We can only go so far. With our litigation, with our communications work, with our education work, the state has got enormous power to make changes here. And the way it does it is through policy. So it's vitally important. Imagine a few years ago, the British government was making this sort of false distinction, saying that there was a political wing of Hezbollah and a political wing of Hamas. And because of that, people were literally marching down the streets of London with Hezbollah and Hamas flags. There was one demonstration every year called the Al-Quds Day demonstration, where they literally held placards with the slogan, "We are all Hezbollah." And we and others were able to get Hezbollah and Hamas proscribed fully under the Terrorism Act, which means that now if you say that, you would be committing a criminal offence, terrorism offence. That kind of change is enormously important. We're trying at the moment to get the Public Order Act changed in relation to these protests that we're seeing every week, saying things like, well, it's not just about each protest on its own. It's the fact that they're happening every week. It has a cumulative effect. You've got to take that into account. So it's very important that we do this work. It's very important also that we come out in public, as you were saying, and show people up, highlight the issues. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, I'm fond of saying, and I think in the case of anti-Semitism, all the more so.
Now, throughout this podcast, you've mentioned a few times our education work, and I really want to focus on that for a minute. In addition to delivering workshops to professionals and seminars at schools and universities, we also have a team dedicated to the support of Jewish students on campus. Can you tell our listeners about the work that we have been providing Jewish students in Britain, particularly since 7th of October?
First of all, I think the Jewish students that we've been dealing with, pretty much everyone we've been dealing with has shown exceptional bravery and presence of mind, I think, in dealing with what's been going on campus. It's been a terrible situation. Already campuses were bad. Already, I think it was sort of somewhere in the 90% region of our polling of British Jews thought that anti-Semitism on campus is a major problem. This is before October 7th. So now we're in a world where you've got encampments on university campuses up and down the country. You've got students who are facing violence on campus. We had in Leeds, for example, the Jewish chaplain had to literally go into hiding and then leave the country. We had people on campus saying things like "Thank you, Houthis," referring to Ansar Allah, the Houthi movement in Yemen, which was at the time shooting at British Royal Navy ships. You've got really extreme stuff going on, and it's scary. A lot of the support we've been providing has been legal support. So in the past, to give an example that's now sort of run its course more or less, you have David Miller, who was at the University of Bristol. We actually sued the University of Bristol on behalf of 3 very brave Jewish students, and he was dismissed a couple of weeks after we issued proceedings. That kind of support is one form of what we do. We also go and speak on campuses. We've got a student ambassador program, which I think now is active on 20 campuses across the UK. This is where we're training up students to what to look out for, get in touch with us as soon as there is something that needs dealing with. We then bring the top lawyers free of charge onto that to deal with it. And ultimately, it's down to the bravery of the students. And if we can help to give them free legal advice, take legal action where necessary, provide speakers, and perhaps most importantly, help them to highlight what's going on campuses so the whole country can see it, I think that's a good job for us to be doing.
CAA is very proud to be a volunteer-led organisation. Can you tell our listeners what does that exactly mean? And for those who might like a sneak peek behind the scenes, how does CAA work? Who do we have to keep it all going? Also, if people want to get involved, how can they do that?
So when we started CAA, as I said, sort of in 2014, we didn't have any money or resources or anything. We didn't have any staff. We didn't have an office, nothing. So everything was done by volunteers, including me. I volunteered for nearly 5 years. And I think that volunteers demand a lot of the charity that they volunteer with, rightly so. They're giving their time, which is one of the most valuable things that anybody has. People have varying amounts of money, but most people have, an amount of time. They've got 24 hours a day, and they've got an amount of that they can give. And to everybody who gives that time, it's usually quite valuable time. So they also bring talents that we could never afford. If we had to pay for all of the talent that is given to us, we'd never afford it. And sort of behind the scenes, what that looks like is that pretty much everything in CAA, yes, there are staff who support it, but everything from our accounting through to preparing evidence files for police forces, That's done by volunteers. The staff that we have, I think the average age in our staff team is probably 27, 28, something like that. It's a young, dynamic, it's a group of people who essentially would love to volunteer full time, but they need to live as well. So it's really people who are very passionate about it. I think behind the scenes, pretty much everybody who comes to us, people assume, oh, you've got to be a lawyer or something like that. You really don't have to be a lawyer. I think maybe lawyers are maybe 5% of our volunteers. We've got thousands of people who've signed up to volunteer with us. And the people that we use, they tend to be meticulous, determined, precise, and we train them up in a particular area. A lot of people who came to us had no sort of skill in dealing with anti-Semitism before. They'd never had to do it. And we train them up, and then we put them to work in very specific units. So we've got units which are focused on communication. We've got investigations and enforcement units, some of which are quite specialised. So we've got a political and government investigations unit, demonstration and event monitoring unit. We've got a scrutiny unit, for example, which does freedom of information requests to hundreds of public bodies every year. We've got people who fundraise. We've got people who go into schools and universities and educate. We've got people who train police forces. All of these people, we train up, we show them how to do it, and then they just pour their time and talent into CAA and make it so much more than we could ever afford if we were trying to just do this by growing our staff team.
It's pretty amazing.
I think it's pretty cool. I think one of the things I'm proudest of about it, though, is that it's not just Jewish volunteers. We've got a lot of volunteers who aren't Jewish.
Yeah.
And that's I think still, I know it sounds tacky, but it still inspires me because anti-Semitism is a societal problem. It's not a Jewish problem. And it's only by finding people like this who understand it on that level and are willing to stand up for Jewish people, not because they are Jewish, but because they want Britain to be better.
Yeah.
They want Britain to live up to its reputation for decency and tolerance, and they're willing to do something about it. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And when it comes to proudest moments, there are a lot of very proud moments. I think some of them are sort of moments of personal pride. Sometimes I sort of walk into the office and I see lots of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to devote their time and talent to fighting anti-Semitism, working on some pretty cool, unusual stuff that they came up with, and which I don't know how to do. And I think, wow, that makes me feel very proud. The fact that they're able to do that, the fact that CAA, when we started CAA, I was able to do all of the things that CAA could do. In fact, a lot of the time I did do all of the things the CAA was doing. But then very rapidly it changed. Now it's a place where it's the sum of a lot of people's talents, and there is no one person who can do all of what we do. So that makes me proud. I think that the March Against Antisemitism was a very proud moment, because I felt that we'd managed to bring together a Jewish community that was reeling from October 7th, and a lot of people who aren't Jewish and were looking for some way to show solidarity with Jews but didn't know how to do it. And many of them came from far and wide all over the country. They'd never been on demonstration or a march before, and they came and stood with us. I think some of the court cases where it's been a real slog to get the result and a lot of uncertainty along the way. I think the Equality and Human Rights Commission piece was one of those, by the way, because that wasn't actually a court case. That was one where we referred something to a regulator and then had a lot of legal engagement with that regulator over the course of a couple of years. That, for me, was, everybody been gaslighting the Jewish community for a long time, saying, you're making this up, it's all exaggerated. We were able to vindicate the community, vindicate what everybody had been saying. There are a lot of proud moments, but the thing that I'm most proud of probably
Is this podcast?
is this podcast. Yeah, exactly. That we've reached 100 episodes of the Podcast Against Antisemitism. There you go.
Yeah.
I was actually going to say the people and the fact that we've managed to bring together some of the most amazing people, some of the most amazing friends I've met through doing this, and there's no way otherwise I'd probably have ever come into contact with them.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because I don't know if you found this, but when I tell people that I fight anti-Semitism for a living, I think a lot of people think it's maybe a bit depressing. But I say, no, I work with some of the best people. I feel very inspired and empowered, and it's fascinating. You feel like you're doing something great. And as you say, I think the people are a really big part of that. I've worked in some places, not naming any names, but I've worked in some places where the people aren't so great. And it makes a big difference when they are.
I love you too, but look, you're right. When it's like with any problem, if you've got something on your mind and it's really bugging you, it will depress you. It will get you down until you come up with a plan and feel that you can do something about it. And for me, anti-Semitism is like that. I don't know how I would feel right now since October 7th if I didn't feel through what we do at CAA that I was able to do something about it. And it's like, have we ended anti-Semitism? Are we about to announce on Thursday that anti-Semitism's over, we fixed the problem? No. But do we feel day in, day out that we're actually doing something about anti-Semitism? Most definitely. And that's probably the most fulfilling, rewarding, reassuring thing that we could be doing right now, I think.
Yeah, and I also want to say, when people write in to say that they're very happy and pleased with what we're doing, that it means a lot, we see that. We see your emails and thank you, because it really does make a big difference. Speaking of proud moments, this is episode 100 of the podcast. And I'm very proud of that. So in the spirit of episode 100, do you have any favourite podcast episodes or moments that you would like to share?
I'm going to take the conch and I'm going to turn that back on you, because actually I think you should be very proud that this is episode 100. When you started doing this, I don't think anyone ever anticipated that there would suddenly be a day somehow where it was episode 100 time, and a vast amount of work has gone into this. The podcast reaches, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people all over the world. In a way, it's kind of one of those mediums, podcasting, where it's a little bit difficult to know exactly who you're reaching and how you're affecting them. It's not like X or something where you put something up and someone replies underneath it. The podcast is it's like radio or something. You broadcast it and you hope it's having an effect. And by now, we actually see it's having a very big effect. There are a lot of people who are out there who are tuning in all the time, who are listening to every episode. We get people who constantly say things like, for example, when I tell people that I'm from CAA, they're like, "Oh, CAA, that's the guy with the curly hair, right?" Yeah. And so I'm like, yes, I do work with Ellie, yeah. But seizing the conch, you've done 100 episodes. What's your proudest episode?
So besides this one, obviously, I think that the one that really stands out is episode number 2, which is with Eddie Marzen. So I reached out to Eddie Marzen after I saw him in Ridley Road, and he played a really interesting role. And I said, "Would you like to come on the podcast and talk about it?" By this point, the podcast hadn't even launched yet, and I just didn't really know how he would reply. He replied very quickly and was actually honoured to do it. Very, very nice guy. We stayed in touch, and he actually was one of the speakers at the March Against Antisemitism. It was also one of my mum's favourite episodes, which is always nice. Another one that stands out is Simon Miller. He's a professional wrestler, big wrestling fan. I've
just got to say, every time I sign into the CAA X account or Instagram or anything, I'm just suddenly like, why is there so much wrestling in our feed? It's you.
It is. I should do that on my personal account.
No. I was just always like, why is the algorithm associating the fight against anti-Semitism with fighting in wrestling? But apparently, it's just you.
Yeah, yeah. And more recently, some of the episodes that have been incredibly poignant, actually, was with some of the people who were there on October 7th. I had the privilege of interviewing Natalie Sanandaji, who is a survivor of the Nova Festival massacre. And the bravery and the clarity with which she spoke, I just thought was unbelievable. If you're curious to hear a real account of someone who was there, I highly recommend it. I think everyone who doubts October 7th, it should be mandatory listening. Same with Elad Poterman. He was locked in his safe room with his wife and baby for hours and hours while Hamas were right outside. And, I also got to speak to Elon Keshet, who is a relative of the Bibas family who was still held hostage by Hamas. The opportunity to get to speak to these unbelievable people is something I do not take for granted. And it's actually one of the favorite bits of this job, not just for the podcast, but the job. So I would say, to be honest, those are some of the highlights. You have a mix of more lighthearted, celebrity entertainment, but you also have some really hard-hitting episodes. So I would say that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in fact, and my answer to the question is I agree with Ellie.
Okay, good. That's always the correct answer, I think. Let me ask you, where do you see the fight against anti-Semitism going, and what is next for CAA?
So, next for CAA, I don't want to give away too much, but we're fighting, university encampments and campuses are back. We've got the protests which seem to be gearing back up again after a slight lull at points during the summer. We have this continued outpouring on social media. We've got a new government, or new-ish government, which we need to do the things that the last government didn't do. And we've got a British public which I think is increasingly alive to some of the dangers that are present within sort of Islamist and far left groups, as well as the far right, as well as we saw this summer. But I think we need to seize on all of these issues, and we need to push very, very hard. There are other issues in there as well where we're active. We've got a lot of private prosecutions in the pipeline. Some of those actually just recently have now resulted in the Crown Prosecution Service taking over and charging people who they previously shown no interest in, and now because of our private prosecutions are actually acting. We've got various things that we're doing to do with media bias, which hopefully we'll be able to say more about in the coming months. But in terms of the bigger picture, beyond CAA, the fight against anti-Semitism, I think the biggest challenge by far is shown up by this polling I mentioned earlier, which shows that 18 to 24-year-olds are so much more likely to be anti-Semitic than any other part of the population. Like we have a scale, a peer-reviewed scale, which involves 12 questions, some of them positive, some of them negative, and the answers to those questions give us a pretty clear view as to whether somebody is anti-Semitic or not. And we've been using that particular scale since 2020. And anti-Semitism was going down, and then some point around 2022, it suddenly starts ticking up. And the reason for that seems to be that Gen Z is suddenly starting to appear in polling, because polling only covers people 18 and over. And we start to see Gen Z coming in there. If you look, for example, on our scale, people who agreed with 4 or more anti-Semitic statements. So these are people who don't just hold 1 or 2 anti-Semitic views, they hold 4 or more. Amongst the 18 to 24-year-old category, that's 32% of them hold 4 or more anti-Semitic views. versus 9% in the 65 plus category. So that's more than triple. It's actually more than double the next age bracket. The next age bracket, I think, is 25 to 49. 17% of them hold 4 or more anti-Semitic views. These are still pretty startling, but the fact is that the 18 to 24-year-olds are a world apart in the level of anti-Semitism. So we could have all the success we want in dealing with anti-Semitism on protests, maybe even having some of these particularly hateful marches banned. We could get the government to proscribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. We could get all of those successes under our belt. But if at the end of the day our sort of demographic chart is filling up generation by generation with more and more people who have hate in their heart and are quite openly anti-Semitic and believe that being anti-Semitic is almost sort of being on the right side of history, then we're finished. Not just as Jews in this country, but as a country, because they don't just believe crazy things about Jews. They are extreme in many other ways. We know this from quite a few studies and quite a few different types of polling, not just ours. So I think the fight against anti-Semitism now is, in a way, a fight for the West. It's a fight for decency. It is a fight for tolerance. It is a fight against extremism. If we, in the West, fail to convince people that they shouldn't get all of their news from TikTok, that there is right and wrong in the world, that sometimes your enemy has to be defeated, that there are certain ideologies which are extremely dangerous, and these are not, these are not sort of somehow benign or interesting or sort of quirky things to say, but they're actually dangerous. I think that the West is lost. So the fight against anti-Semitism increasingly is the fight for civilization. And I know that that sounds like, everybody would say that if they're part of a campaigning charity, say, well, our fight is the fight for civilization, but it really is. Because anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and extremist ideologies, they do threaten the whole underpinning of the Western world as we know it. So I think the fight against anti-Semitism is going to have to go there, and what we're going to have to see is alliance across, this is sort of across the political spectrum, across any kind of political party lines or anything like that. This is something where decent people of the left of centre, of the right of centre, of the centre itself, seize on certain issues where they just say, look, we agree on these things. We might disagree on all sorts of other things, but in terms of the fundamentals of what we want our countries to be, this is what they are. And I think that is that is basically where the fight against anti-Semitism is headed, and particularly with the younger generations coming up now, they are the ones that we have to persuade. And if we fail, then civilization will, the face of civilization will change.
Gideon, I'm going to ask you a question now, which I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says, I want to help, they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, but they don't know where to start, what should they do? Where should they start?
Look, for people who want to really get involved, volunteer with us. We'd love to have people joining us and pouring their talents into the fight against anti-Semitism. But it's also not for everybody. A lot of people have a lot going on in their lives. It's not that they can, everybody, there's a lot of people already do volunteer with some other charity as well. So there are a few things they can do. One, and this is perhaps the hardest one, but one of the most important, when you see anti-Semitism, stand up to it. Don't let people think that by spouting anti-Semitism or extremist beliefs that there's a sort of tacit acceptance or even encouragement of it. Silence, unfortunately, just encourages this, and people need to stand up against it. So that's the first thing. For those who don't feel comfortable doing that, read into the subject. There are a lot of really good books out. There are also a lot of really good podcasts that you can listen to. There's a lot of good social media material. So like follow @Antisemitism, which is us, and you will start to get a flavour for what's going on in the world and what needs to be done about it. There's another thing I think they can do, which is speak to Jewish people and speak to your other friends who aren't Jewish. To the Jewish people, say, look, are you okay? I just want you to know I'm really concerned by what's happening at the moment and I'm with you. I cannot tell you how much good that does. And to your non-Jewish friends, speak to them as well and just say, look, this really concerns me, that this is happening. Is there anything that maybe together we can do about this? Is there some kind of awareness campaign that we maybe can run in our company? We go and speak in a lot of companies, for example, at CAA. We train police forces, we train regulators. Is there something like that people can organise and bring us in to do? Is it maybe they do something less formal? They get together with a group of friends and they organise some kind of an event. They invite someone to come and speak at their local community. That kind of thing, I think, has a real impact, because ultimately anti-Semitism thrives when people think that they're in the right and they sort of have the backing of the public. And the more that people see that actually the public want decency and don't like racism, the more you see that, the more they see that, I think the more that it's, they're discouraged from being openly anti-Semitic. And that's a big part of the fight, is trying to push anti-Semitism back into the fringes and away from being some kind of acceptable view to voice or spout in public.
Gideon, before we wrap up, please tell the listeners what have you got going on, what have you got coming up, and where can people find you?
They can probably find me in the office at all hours of the day.
We're not giving you our address.
No. But this is, this is a very consuming thing, I suppose. This is where I am. They can follow @Antisemitism. I post on my own social media sort of once in a blue moon, but if they want to follow me, I'm @Gideon Falter. Generally speaking, follow CAA. That's where all of our efforts are poured.
Very good. Gideon Falter, I think that just about does it. Thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to seeing you in episode 200.
All right. Very good.
Is that all right, do you think?
I thought it was very good.